today we're going to be teaching the whole class. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited you're here. I hope you're doing well. So last week, this is our 6th week in a row that we've done everything streaming. This is the 4th week that I've been teaching class, and the 2nd week in which we've been adding the children's class as part of this. That was sort of a very last-minute decision last week. I know I announced it in the beginning of this period last week. I can't, if you turned in late or tuned in late, you may not have heard. So I thought I'd explain. This is the only class that we have that's streaming. And as such, everyone in the congregation has the potential to be in it. And I realize that though I'm used to teaching people nearly my age, adult classes, that there are lots of people in here that are much, much younger and sometimes really young. So what I've done is every week Pat sends out my notes. It's a 2-page PowerPoint. It looks like this. It comes to you as PowerPoint and PDF. If you're not getting them, check your inbox and make sure you did get it. But if you're not getting them, send Pat a note at pat@centralfamily.org, and we'll try to make sure you get them. But if you print it two-sided like I do, then what you do is the inside has all the outline of the class, and then this is the front and the back. And so what you do, just simply print. I take my straight edge, I put it there, I bend it, fold it. Has a nice little handout, fits neatly in my Bible. On the front's the cover. On the back is a coloring sheet. And in the inside would be the notes for the class. So the coloring sheet's kind of new to me. I don't typically do it for the 60-year-olds that are in my class. But because we have the larger class, it's going to be offered. This class will be taught in 2 parts. The first part will be taught by Tim and Jimmy, and it's designed to teach the younger children. And then I will teach the second part, but we're going to teach the same topic, and namely, today's topic's the parable of the sower. So we're going to focus in that right now. You can send in your comments. It is live. Right now we are live. Rodney is sitting right there beside me. He can take and read your notes, transfer questions to me, comments to me. Feel free to enter those or send those. And so we will continue that way. My intent is to continue to use this format for the next several weeks, and as long as we're doing this, all of which is still terribly unknown, but we can adapt and we can adjust. I am open to suggestion for how to make it better. So if you have those, let myself know. You can send a copy to Pat or John. They'll get to me as well. But we are looking forward to teach today's parable of the sower. If you look inside, you'll notice that this parable is actually recorded in 3 different places in the Gospels. All the Gospels except John record this parable, and for all the most part, there's little variation in them. A lot of the parables will have slight variations, but not a lot with this one. And so Matthew records it, Mark records it, Luke records it, and they are very, very similar. So we will now get ready to turn this class over to Mr. Tim and Miss Jimmy. So if you're ready, we'll turn it over to them, and we'll come back, and we'll talk about this with the adults.
Good morning, everyone. In a few moments, Mr. Robert Wade will continue his Bible class on the parables of Jesus. Before he begins, Miss Jimmy and myself, Mr. Tim, will have a short lesson for the children. If you look in the back of your lesson handout, Mr. Robert has provided us with another coloring page. Now, this is for children of all ages, so please, when you completed it, email it to Miss Pat or place it on the central private Facebook group so everyone has a chance to see it. Today's lesson is on the parable of the sower.
Oh, Mr. Tim, I know all about sewing. I sew in the morning, I sew in the evening, and I even sometimes sew in the noontime. In fact, I made this outfit. It's pretty nice, isn't it? Miss Kathleen taught me everything I know about sewing. In fact, we had a business, a sewing business. Of course, it only lasted for a day, so maybe that doesn't count. But I do have 3 sewing machines at my house, so that must prove that I really know a lot about sewing.
No, silly. We are not talking about sewing with a needle and thread. We are talking about planting seeds by scattering them on the earth. Now, Jesus talked a lot about planting and harvesting crops when he taught people about God's kingdom. So in today's lesson, Jesus tells about a farmer who sowed seed on different kinds of soil.
Well, we happen to have some seeds and some soil up here that Jesus talked about. The first soil was pretty hard soil. This is soil that you'd find along a road or on a pathway. People have walked on it, so it's pretty hard. Pretty hard, Mr. Tim. Can't seed or sow any seeds on this very well. You put them on there and they just kind of lay on top.
Yes, this is, I assure you, very hard, as it's been packed, as people walked on it. And if you throw a seed on there, it's going to be easy pickings for the birds.
That's right. But then Jesus talked about another soil, and that was the rocky soil. A lot of rocks here, but if you look closely, there is a little bit of dirt. And if you put some seeds in that, they'll start to grow, and the roots will go down, but there's not much soil. So those poor roots can't go very far to get to the water and the nutrients. You might get a plant like this poor little plant, but the sun will come out and beat down on that poor little plant, and since his roots aren't very deep, he just wilts like this poor little plant. Not a good place to put seeds.
Yes, the plant will grow quite quickly because there is some soil, but it is pretty shallow. And you're right. When the hot sun comes out, that poor plant's going to shrivel up and wither away.
Not a good soil. Now, then we have another soil that Jesus talked about. It was the soil with weeds, thorny weeds. Now, you don't want this in your garden for sure because they will grow, the weeds will grow really well. But they just kind of take over everything. And they'll let other plants grow. In fact, there are a couple of plants here. Mr. Tim, if you'll look closely, there's one over here and there's one here.
Ow.
That's why I said thorny weeds. You don't want to be around those.
You're right. These thorny weeds will definitely crowd out any sort of plants that try to grow in there.
Yeah, not a good place to put seeds for growing. But then the fourth soil was the good soil. It's nice and soft. Wow, you can put seeds in there and they will start growing. The roots can go way down into the ground and to get that water and the nutrients. They'll just grow really nicely. While you have 30 times more, 60 times more, even 100 times more than what you planted. This is the kind of soil you want.
Yes, this is a beautiful soil. Definitely would grow beautiful plants. Now that is a good story, but what does Jesus want us to learn from it? Maybe it is teaching us how to be good farmers. It does give us good instructions on how to best plant a crop, but knowing Jesus, I'm sure it has a better lesson than that to teach us. Let's read the parable from the book of Mark in the New Testament, and then let's hear what Mr. Robert has to say about what Jesus wants us to learn about sowing seeds.
So everybody get your Bibles, turn to the New Testament, the book of Mark. That's the second book in the New Testament, in chapter 4.
Now let those with ears use them and listen.
Well, you said listen. I want to be sure because God is talking to us. I want to be sure that I listen real carefully.
Thank you, Miss Jimmy. I am now going to read the parable of the sower to everyone, beginning in chapter 4, verse 1 of Mark. Another time, Jesus began teaching by the lake. A great crowd gathered around him, so he got into the boat and went out on the lake. All the people stayed on the shore close to the water. Jesus used many stories to teach them. He said, "Listen, a farmer went out to plant a seed. Well, the farmer's planting some seed fell by the road. The birds came and ate all the seed. Some seed fell in rocky ground where there wasn't much dirt. The seed grew very fast there because the ground was not deep. But when the sun rose, the plants withered. The plants died because they did not have deep roots. Some other seeds fell among thorny weeds. The weeds grew and choked the good plants. So those plants did not make grain. Some other seeds fell on good ground. In the good ground, the seed began to grow. It grew and made a crop of grain. Some plants made 30 times more grain, some 60 times more grain, and some 100 times more grain."
Now I'm going to read about what Jesus said and what all these different soils meant. So you're going to move down to verse 13 now. Mr. Tim finished at verse 8, but we're going to go down to verse 13, and that's a 1 and a 3. It's the little number, so everybody find that, and this is what Jesus said it meant. Then Jesus said to the followers, "Do you understand this story? If you don't, then how will you understand any story? The farmer is like a person who plants God's teaching in people. Sometimes the teaching falls on the road. This is like some people. They hear the teaching of God, but Satan quickly comes and takes away the teaching that was planted. Others are like the seed planted on rocky ground. They hear the teaching and quickly accept it with joy, but they don't allow the teaching to go deep into their lives. They keep it only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the teaching, they quickly give up. Others are like the seed planted among the thorny weeds. They hear the teaching, but then other things come into their lives. Worries, the love of money, and wanting all other kinds of things. These things stop the teaching from growing. So that teaching does not produce fruit in their lives. Others are like the seed planted in the good ground. They hear the teaching and accept it. Then they grow and produce fruit. Sometimes 30 times more, sometimes 60 times more, and sometimes 100 times more.
Thank you, Miss Jimmy. And now we will hear from Mr. Robert as he brings us the lesson.
Well, very good. That was an excellent little performance there, and luckily we didn't get dirt all over the stage when we filmed it. I've learned that turning on my mic is handy. I've got that resolved, so now we will proceed further. The parable is the parable of the sower. Tim and Jimmy just read. They read from the account from the book of Mark. And you'll notice a couple interesting things. One's right in the middle of it, they skipped a few verses. And in all three accounts, Matthew and Luke's account as well, there's a section that's right in the middle of this parable, and we're going to talk about that. So you heard the story. It's a simple parable. And the parable is a farmer sowing seed. And as this is the kind of seed that you throw and you spread out, not like a row crop, but you throw the seed out like you would something like wheat. He throws it all over the place. Some lands on a path, and the birds eat it. Some land on the rocky soil. It grows quickly because there's soil, but because of all the rocks, the roots don't go deep. And by the time the sun comes out, they can't access water, and the plants wither. Some fall on the weeds, and the weeds will choke them out. If you've ever seen weeds, weeds can grow anywhere. I can get weeds to grow through my concrete on my driveway. I don't know why, but they will grow right through there. And then when they get near a plant, a good plant that you need, they will choke it out. And then some falls on good soil, very soft. We used to have a garden. My parents were very big into gardens. And they conscripted us children to work that garden. And the only part about the garden that I ever liked was the very first, when it was being planted. After the garden plot has been tilled, the soil is wet, it's soft. You can take your hand and put it right down into the soil 3 or 4 inches. I always enjoyed that part. And as you plant our garden in rows, we would mark it with a string where the row would be, and then we walked down on the other side. And it didn't take but just a few minutes, and you had formed a path, a hardened path, and where you could not plant seed. It was hardened down, and the seed would not go in. But in that soft spot, the seed would sink deep, and it ultimately would grow. And so this is a fascinating parable. Let me tell you why I think this parable is fascinating. So you know what the Sermon on the Mount is. Most people have heard of it. The Sermon on the Mount was at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. Certainly not the first thing, but just about near the very beginning. And in this sermon, recorded by Matthew, at least that's the most complete account we have, Jesus steps up onto a hillside and begins to preach. It's not triggered by an event such as someone asking him a question or crowds forcing him to do something or putting him in some situation. In this particular account, he just initiates the action. And in this, he begins to say some very direct things. You have heard it said, and he'll describe something from the law, but I tell you, and he'll say something else. And so as he preaches, there's not a lot of confusion or ambiguity about what he's talking about. It is clear. It's not covered in vague terms or shadowy terms. It's fairly straightforward. And as he begins to preach, the crowds begin to acknowledge his authority, and they begin to admire his ability to speak. They're stunned. But nothing about Jesus' lesson is difficult to understand. It may be difficult to do, but it's not difficult to understand. And so very early in this ministry, he was fairly clear about what he was wanting to talk about. By the time we see this parable being read, Jesus is still in Galilee. That's the northern part, north of Judea. And he is still active, but he's starting to draw attention. And it's intriguing the attention that he's getting, because all three of these accounts record it in slightly different places, but all three accounts record tension between him and people who are listening to him. So the first one that's recorded is actually the section that Miss Jimmy and Mr. Tim skipped, because it's not part of the parable itself, but it's part of the story. And the disciples come to him in Matthew chapter 13, which is the account I'm going to read from, 13th chapter of Matthew. in the 10th verse, he has just stated the parable. He's not yet explained it, but he stated the parable. And the disciples came to him and asked, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" So we do not hear the tone of their voice. And the tone of their voice can change the way you read that statement. A tone that says, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" is different from, "Why do you speak in parables?" And so one is exasperated or frustrated, confused, and maybe just a wee bit annoyed. And the other one's just intellectually curious. I believe when I read it, I hear exasperated and annoyed. So now Jesus is speaking, and he's speaking in parables, and the 12 are curious about why he speaks in such an unclear way. Because though the parables may seem clear to us, only because we have long since had a chance to understand them, long since seen them implemented, and we already believe. But for those who do not, it is a very, very challenging thing. And so what you'll see here is that Jesus will now begin to speak in parables, and they ask him this question. The reason I think they're frustrated, the disciples, is because his answer implies the frustration. In verse 11, he replied, "The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them." That's stunning. He is saying that he is not intending to give them clarity. Whoever has been given more and will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. This is why I speak to them in parables. And that little line right there is a part of the parable of the talents. He'll repeat that line about being given more and taken in the parable of the talents. And then he quotes Isaiah, "Though seeing they do not see, though hearing they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy. You'll be ever hearing but never understanding. You'll be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them." That's an exasperating answer. And I believe that's why the 12 apostles were really frustrated. Because one, they have expectations of what this man's going to be. They have expectations of what Jesus, the Messiah, is going to be. And I'm starting to get the feeling that he is failing to meet expectations. Okay? And so that is a frustrated answer because they probably want something that is hostile in nature. We're going to defeat the enemy. We're going to drive them out in God's name and something like that. And so here he is speaking in parables with a lot less clarity. They're frustrated. So Jesus is not it does not appear to be appealing to the 12. It's not only the 12 that are frustrated, there are others. And when you look at, and all three accounts are quoted, but in Matthew's, it's just before the parable, so it's the end of chapter 12. Jesus' mother and his brothers, in verse 46, stood outside wanting to speak to him, in which he would not speak to them. In Mark's account, it states very clearly they came to confront him. So Jesus is now failing to meet the expectations of his followers. He's now failing to meet the expectations of his family. It goes on. We also read that disciples or Pharisees from Jerusalem have now moved up to Galilee to confront him. And when they get up there and talk to him, they say, "You are doing all this by the devil." And that's not just an expression. They meant that really. And so Jesus is failing to meet the expectations of the leaders. Why at this point does he begin to speak in parables? Okay. We know in the Sermon on the Mount that he could speak very straight very clear. But that's when he had very few followers. It would appear that by this time, that Jesus is now starting to rattle the cages of those around him. And I think that's fascinating, that that's when he really begins to speak in parables in wholesale. The Sermon on the Mount is a well-known, of course the Bible never uses that term, but we do. The Sermon on the Mount is a well-known sermon, but this one is just as important, and yet we don't have a name for it. Is referred to as the Sermon by the Seashore. And if you look in 13, verse 1, Jesus went out from the house and sat by the lake. That lake is Lake Tiberias, which is probably the correct name of what we call the Sea of Galilee. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables. And what you'll see is, beginning with this parable of the sower, he'll then fall through the next chapter or so, quoting parable after parable after parable after parable. So the expectations are being frustrated because he's not speaking the way people want him to speak. And so when that happens, he then switches to parables, making it even more challenging to understand. That's just, to me, fascinating. And yet that is exactly what Jesus did. We need to be mindful, and what's interesting is that we need to be mindful of our hearts. And that's what this parable is about. The idea here is the farmer throws seed onto the ground. And the type of the ground that it lands on determines how that seed grows. All the verses, all the accounts state that this seed is God's word. So what does that make the soil? Well, that makes the soil our hearts. And so some of our hearts are packed, hardened down. They're not interested in hearing, they don't want to hear, they're not going to take it in. And it never goes into the ground, just like the soil in that garden. Once you pack it, like the one you saw Miss Jimmy hit it with that hard spoon, once you pack it, the seed cannot go into the ground. And if the seed does not go into the ground, the seed does not produce fruit or crop. Never gets started. And Jesus explains to us, and that's exactly the meaning of this parable, of that soil. It is the soil that they hear the word, but they just do not accept it. And then the birds come, they eat the seed. Your seed is waste. Well, we'll talk about the wasting of the seed. The seed does not get into the heart, therefore does not produce a crop, and therefore it's gone. Never takes hold. The parable then talks about the seed falling on the rocky soil. And when the seed falls on the rocky soil, it says this: it will grow because there is soil, but the rocks in it and all the block the growth of the roots. So once again, if I recall my garden days, the ground was always soft when you tilled it. But during the summer, as the summer wears on, even the ground and dirt right around the plant itself will become hardened from the summer sun. The only way that that plant can live is that if its roots go down into the ground below the crusty top to where the water and the nutrients are. When the soil is rocky, the rocks block the growth of the roots. And in this case, what the parables say very clearly, the plant will grow, but when the sun comes out, it will dry up and the plant will wither. And this is the case of a heart who hears the word, gets excited, accepts it, but once pressure comes, once hard times come, once something that challenges your faith, once your friends begin to say you're silly, once your family begins to isolate you, once bad things happen, you wither and fade away, and you produce no crop either. That's a hard statement. That's a hard statement to live with. And I bet there's some who think today's times are similar to such things. And we can talk about that toward the end of this class. The third soil, the weeds. Like I said, I can grow weeds through my driveway, but I can't grow grass in my yard. I've never figured that out. It must be something I'm doing. But weeds are tough. And weeds don't share. And when your crop or your thing that you want to grow, your food source or your grass desires to grow, the weeds will come up and choke it out. And Jesus tells us that has a very specific meaning to the heart of man as well. Those are people who take the word, are excited by the word, they let it grow, but it's their passions and their desires, not their fears and their troubles, like to do with the rocky soil. Their passions and their desires get their attention, draw them away, and they choke out the good crop. And it produces no crop as well. And then the fourth soil, the soil that's tilled, the soil that's good soil, the seed will go in and it will produce more than which it had when it started. And so when you look about when Jesus is talking about these parables, if you look at his response to the 12, you see very much this sort of thing. He is interested in people with good hearts who are interested in his word, not for what they can gain from it necessarily, though you can gain from God's word. But if you want it to solve your problems and all of your problems don't go away and hard times come, bad things will occur with your crop. And if you're drawn away by your desires, or drawn away by your passions, your own things that you seek out, they too will choke out your ability to grow. And so Jesus now speaking to parables because he wants their hearts, he wants them to take his word as his word, not because of their expectations of him. Jesus is failing to meet expectations when he begins to speak in parables. His disciples are not expecting him. His family, his mother, his brothers, they're not doing what he expects them to do. And certainly the leaders in Jerusalem are becoming concerned about what he's becoming. And they come to attack him. Instead of addressing those concerns directly, he is pressing us for our hearts. This is the important thing I want you to understand. To a serious and significant degree, you control your heart. You can ask the Lord, I believe you can ask the Lord to till up your ground. So if you ever seen packed soil, you can put the tiller to it and it'll become plantable again. You can remove the rocks, you can pull the weeds. But for a great degree, we control how we receive the word. The word is what it is. And how you allow it to enter your heart is really a great deal of our decision. But I think there's a second part of this parable that we don't talk about. And maybe this is my days in a garden with an agriculture-based family. If I had been the farmer, if I were the kid of the farmer who was told to sow seed, and I threw the seed onto the road, into the creek, onto the piles of rocks, or into the weeds, my parents would have had a discussion about my intelligence and my utility as a farmer, okay? They would have suggested first of all, they would have suggested I correct the error now, and then I consider a different career field in the future, okay? Because if I were to tell my father I had thrown it all over the road, he would say, I just wasted the seed. You just wasted it. Because it can't grow there. It will never grow there. If the cars don't flatten it and destroy it, the birds will get it. It was wasted. But what's intriguing about this parable is that there is no issue whatsoever with the farmer throwing the seed on these crazy places. I think there's a second lesson for us to gather. Because what the Lord is asking us to do is not to assess the soil. Our Lord is asking us to throw the seed. It is not our decision to decide the worthiness of the soil. And what that means, it's not our decision to decide the worthiness of the person that we are speaking and giving the seed to. We should never say, you know, I can tell your heart is hard and packed. I'm not even going to bother throwing seed here because I would waste it. It is not our call. And this farmer who would have been condemned from an agriculture class was never condemned from a spiritual class. We are not to assess the soil. So, I think those are the two primary lessons we would look. Our hearts are represented by these soils, and we need to examine our hearts. So these times have given you opportunity to relook at things. They've given us a chance to re-examine things. None of us wants this situation with this virus to be here. I would rather be looking out here and seeing 300 people than I am looking out and seeing 3. I like the 3 gentlemen here, but I'd rather see 100 times more. And so none of us asked for that. And so in a very kind of ironic sort of way, like the seed, we're isolated and buried in the ground away from all the others. This might be a good opportunity to look for chances to produce fruit in ways we have not ever thought about before. But we represent the soil. You and I are represented by the soil, but you and I are also represented by the farmer. We are the ones throwing the seed. We do not define the seed. We do not give the seed growth. I can tell you the farmer has no control over the germination process. All that farmer knows, if I throw it, then whatever God's creation will do will take over and make it grow or not grow. But it has nothing to do with the farmer. All the farmer has to do is throw it to the ground, and then we'll let the Lord take it from there. We are not in the job of doing soil analysis. We're not our job to determine the worthiness of who we give the seed to. We're just to give the seed. It's the Lord who makes it grow. So as we look, we have to examine, I think, all the time, what's choked us if we're not growing. Not only growing in the sense of spiritualness, but growing in the sense of producing others and encouraging others. I know, so I joined Facebook last week for the first time. I think I was on it like 10 years ago. I found it mostly annoying, just to be quite blunt about it. But I have since joined, and I've joined the Central's private site. I would encourage you to do so if you can. It has been very encouraging. You get information about the state of each other even though we're separated. You get a lot of information about what people are going through and experiencing and sharing and learning. It's encouraging. So I would encourage you, if you're not, to look for that as a way, but it's certainly not the only way. Look for your chances to produce growth, and sometimes growth is stability in those who are weak. Never evaluate the condition of others as worthy of your effort. They're all worthy of your effort. And so that's what we will do. I have come near to the end. I'm looking over at Rodney. Are we got anything we need to address? We're very good. So let me tell you, I tried coloring, but it's actually, you ought to talk and color at the same time. It's not as easy as it looks. So I didn't get very far. But I don't know if you noticed that behind me, several people sent in what they colored last week. And I was excited to see them. But Miss Pat was super excited to see them. And when I got here, ready to prepare for this class, she was here posting them up all on my wall behind me. If you want to send yours in, I would love to see them. Miss Pat would be ecstatic. And then hopefully she'll post them. So it'd be great if we had this whole wall covered. And then we can cover the wall over here behind where Mr. Allen will sit. I'm sure he won't mind if we post that wall behind him as well. it would be delightful, and if you can, do so. The second thing is we're about to transition to, there's a lot of personal decisions. Your life can be affected by bad things. We all have had bad things, and some people have had worse things. And they give us justification for being angry, frustrated, resistant, or whatever. That only hurts you. That only hurts you. Allow the Lord to till your ground and clear your garden, and be willing to accept the Word. And when you accept the Word and you allow it in, it has the potential to do growing and wonderful things. So, Mr. Allen talked about that last week in Romans 6. He talked about making it personal, changing the we's to I's. I think he'll continue to talk on that topic again today. We have reached the end. I'm honored that you allow me into your home. And if you want to send your stuff in to me or Miss Pat, probably Miss Pat's the safest place, or on the website or on the Facebook site, we would love to see it. We will continue off now. Any last thoughts, we will take them, but on behalf of myself, Miss Jimmy, Mr. Tim, Rodney's at the controls, and got Ed and Daniel managing the sound and the internet. From all of us here, we're delighted you allow us into your home. We thank you for your time. You all have a great day. Hide me away.